Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, for the 5th anniversary of the channel, I'm getting around to doing another massive ranking here, the biggest ranking I have done up to this point by a significant margin, and that is a ranking of every player to ever play Big Brother US. To where previously, my biggest ranking I've done was last year when I ranked every BB Can player. However, then there was 148 Big Brother Canada players. With BBUS here, there are 312, literally over double the amount of players. This really ends up being a ridiculous list, obviously on a scale I haven't attempted before. And because of that, I am doing something a bit different here, to where really up to this point, I haven't had any like official multi-parters. However, I decided with this video, I am going to officially split this into 4 parts. This part containing numbers 312 to 241, while beyond that, each part will contain 80 people to make all these videos of an equal enough size, to which if everything goes according to plan, this will be released over the course of the next 2 weeks, to which once the final part comes out, I'll release the entire ranking as one big video. So that is the plan with these releases, where again, this part will be containing the first 72 people that we will be talking about. Now I should mention the fact that, again, this is going to be a ranking of every player to have played Big Brother US. There will be a major exclusion from that, and the fact that no one from BB1 will be on this list is obviously BB1, which is obviously a very different season, wasn't the same game, so those people won't be on, outside of obviously Chicken George, who did play on All Stars, so he will be on this list. Beyond that, there will be no celebrity, there will be no BBOTT on this list. I will probably end up making separate videos for those at some point down the road, and this is simply ranking every player from the mainline series based on how I feel about them as players in the grand scheme of things. Again, not necessarily just their respective seasons. So again, we got a lot to talk through here. With that, let's start off with the ranking. Starting it off at number 312, the worst player of Big Brother US continues to be Jacob from BB9, who I've talked about this in the past, where he was number 1 on my worst players of all time list, and what a shocker, he's on the bottom of this list. Again, he is a player that makes such a boneheaded decision, where there is this power couple in the game that has the sole vote to evict. In his infinite wisdom, he decides to openly target them, ends up lying to them in a very convoluted way that just leads to him coming off as even more sketchy. He was in a position where he should have just been perfectly safe, though actively blows up his own game, which is really what a lot of these bottom place players on this list end up being. To straight up, there are going to be changes from my top 10 worst player list to this current list, though Jacob was someone that had to be in the spot he was in. Never once doubted this decision here. Where Jacob's here at number 312. Now at 311, we're moving on to the second worst player of all time, who is still Willie Hantz. And Willie, for me, again, like I just think is another one. Actively blew up his game. Was given such a cushy landing spot with him being handed HOH, him having these easy outs of people who he wants to target. He could have had a very easy first HOH reign, but then decides to make it just overly complicated by making too many deals. He ends up going on a power trip across the week, to where by the end of the week, he's a dead man walking, doesn't get his target out, and proceeds to get himself ejected from the game. To where it really felt like the only allies he really had in the game were simply just due to the fact that he was handed them through the coach's twists, where had it not been for that, he would have been a complete dead man walking. And again, it feels like a situation where he completely did it to himself. I do think he's a terrible player. He's here at 311. Now number 310, we're moving on to, shockingly, another player from Big Brother 9, and this player is Jen. And I think Jen is kind of an understated worst player of all time, where no one really talks about Jen from BB9, where Jen's another one that I just think actively blows up her game. She's in this position where her and Parker were in the power couple and could have gotten a lot of social capital through doing so, but instead they just make themselves the next target, with Jen being a very abrasive personality that not many people liked. Really, by the end of the season, part of the reason why Ryan ends up losing a jury vote is because people didn't want to give the money to Jen. She also unnecessarily reveals her relationship with Ryan to the rest of the house, which was bad, and again just puts this massive bullseye on her back, while also later throwing Ryan under the bus, which is not a particularly good look. To where, I mean, to be fair, that's probably like the one minor positive I'll give to her, is the fact that she was at least willing to do pretty much anything to stay in the game. But again, the way she played the game was just terrible to begin with. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 310. Number 309, we're getting to some changes on the list here where with my worst players of all time, I did largely exclude the players that were ejected or quit the game in positions where they weren't necessarily going home. But this time I decided to include them. So at 309, we do have Megan from BB19. And I mean, to be fair, in retrospect, I probably could have put Megan on the list, but Megan, I think, is a terrible player and one that seemingly gets paranoid and starts spreading false information about Alex. She's someone that didn't really gel with the cast. It was more than likely going to be the first boot anyway, where again, she was nominated and was the target. Though, to be fair, again, Josh won safety, and then who knows if Cody would have tried to backdoor Paul by the end, but still, I mean, like, someone that was pretty much a social pariah in the house by the time she went home, and even then didn't even stay, obviously, the full round of the game, to where, I think the thing that you can give her at least some credit for is the fact that she did survive the Cameron eviction, though, again, that really wasn't much of anything. So, I do think Megan is a pretty bad player, one that I can't really see doing well in many seasons of Big Brother, and that's why she's here at 309. Now at 308, we're moving on to another really bad player that left due to weird circumstances, and that is Scott from BB4. And obviously Scott gets expelled from the game, though really even before that, I think he was playing a very rocky game, one where while there were seemingly points where he would get along with people, and he did have allies in like Erica and Jack and David, he also was this very frantic personality, getting constantly paranoid and just seemed to be miserable while in the house. And to be fair, part of that is obviously due to the fact that the X Factor was in play here and Amanda was in the house, which he wasn't expecting, but he just really completely cracks under that pressure and makes a massive target of himself, where had it not been for the fact that he was part of the Elite Eight, he probably would have just been the boot in the first week anyway, with there even being talks about backdooring him that first week. To where, again, Scott is a really bad player. For my one credit to him is the fact that he at least had some allies, but again, it's not really enough to put him much higher here than number 308. Number 307, we're moving on to a very recent player of the show, one that was pretty astronomically bad, and here we do have Luke Valentine from BB25, who obviously gets himself expelled by the end of week 1. So he obviously comes off as a massive idiot due to that, but if it wasn't for that, he still would have been a terrible player, as he's still someone that was not really involved in any alliances outside of his creation of the Phalanx 5, which is the only thing I'll give him a little bit of credit for, even though, again, to everyone involved in that, it was a fake alliance, to where by the time at like day 2, he just simply was not involved in anything going on, where had it not been for the fact that he was given initial safety due to how the initial noms functioned, he more than likely would have been on the block against Kirsten, and he more than likely would have been on his way out by the end of that week. And even then, there was talks about backdooring him as well, to where really, again, I feel like Luke plays an all-time bad game. But I don't feel like he really had much prospects moving forward, where no one really wanted to work with him outside of just the general concept of using him as a number just to expose of him later. So because of that, for me, I have Luke here at number 307. Now 306, we're kind of back to more normal players that weren't expelled or quit, and here we do have Jace from BB17, who again I think is a pretty bad player, one that again instantly comes off as a massive threat, one that didn't really seem to know the game that well, was a pretty consensus target for the majority of the house, where while he did have some connections to the Nolan twins and obviously Austin, we did want to keep him, he still was pretty dead to rights at the moment that he went on the block, with him just instantly be looked at as a pretty massive target. And along with that, we also get some pretty actively bad play through him making his alliance with Austin too apparent, to him doing some terrible campaigning, with his campaigning to Steve in particular just being some all-time terrible gameplay there, with him essentially berating Steve while trying to get his vote there. And Jace is someone that I just think came off as a massive target, and someone that was so unaware of his game and really was just so actively bad at trying to stay, to where for me he does end up being here number 306. Number 305, moving on to another player that I've talked about before, and that is Joey from BB16, who again I think is a pretty bad first boot. I mean, Joey is someone that, like, to give her some credit, I could see a world where Joey does well if she returns. I don't think she's someone that's like doomed to just continuously be an early boot, but she's not one that like didn't really seem to know the game particularly well. She did kind of blow up her spot through her being kind of the ringleader of this all women's group that got rat out instantly, and along with that did also have some pretty terrible campaigning to where she was just a pretty clear unanimous vote. And to give her a little bit of credit as well, there is the fact that Caleb didn't actually want to backdoor her. That was a decision that pretty much like everyone kind of forced onto him, so at least there's that. But really just a player that I do think doesn't have that much to really praise for her in her 301 run. So because that for me, she's at 305. Now at 304, we're kind of in a series of a couple people that I think really just had nothing going on in the game. And at 304, we have Ashlea, the first boot of BB6, who, in comparison to some of the people we've talked about already, I think those people are more actively bad in how they played their games, while Ashlea is simply just there. She doesn't really do much. She doesn't really try to play the game. She doesn't really try to really build bonds with a lot of the people in the house. She's simply just there. Someone being targeted right away, gets taken out right away. Again, there's not really much to say about her. She just doesn't really seem to do much in the game. Or again, she just ended up being kind of an easy consensus first boot, so there's not really much to really praise from her, and she's here at number 304. Now, number 303, we have a very similar first boot, and that comes from Carol from BB8. And Carol's another one that, again, didn't really seem to try to play the game that much. She just seemed to be kind of resigned to going out. She was kind of really okay with going out first. She didn't really try to build many relationships in the house. The one thing I would say, between Carol and Ashlea is the fact that Carol at least, came in with a little bit of unlucky circumstances of her rival from high school, and Jessica was in the house with her, which was, again, a really ridiculous situation. Though I do think it's something that painted her in a negative light. So I think that's a bit of unlucky circumstances for her, but really just outside that, she didn't really seem to want to be there. So not much to truly praise, and because that she's here at number 303. Number 302, this is a player that I've gone significantly down on in my latest rewatch of their season, and that person is Holly from BB5. And really, I feel like Holly plays pretty much as terrible of a game as she could. She is someone that had literally no one wanting to keep her around outside of Jace, and even people on her own side were people that ended up leading the charge and getting her out. Or literally her run on the season is her being saved in week 1 because her showmance is HOH, her in week 2 having to be saved by her showmance winning the veto in a position where she was dead to rights had that not been the case, and then in week 3 she's taken out by one of her showmance's main ally. Again, it's a really bad stretch of gameplay with her also having nothing really going on in the game, despite the fact that people thought she was the super smart player when she's anything but. So again, just a really bad player, and she's here at number 302. Now at 301, a player that also had nothing really going on in the game, but at least this person wasn't the target their week they got booted, at least. So that person is Pow Pow from BB16. And again, she didn't do much in the game. Really, I think she's pretty similar to the likes of Ashlea and Carol in the fact that she's not really actively playing the game, and it's kind of looked at as this pretty easy person to take out. Though again, to give her some credit, again, at least she wasn't going to be the initial target, and she had already survived the block in week 1. Again, she was staying for a good chunk of the week in week 2. All the fact that, again, at least she had good bonds with the likes of Donnie and Jocasta and some of the people on that side, or again, she at least had something going on. Again, not much of anything, but still at least something. So because that she's here at number 301. Now number 300, we're moving on back to a player that got taken out due to wonky circumstances. That player is Justin from BB2. And obviously Justin is going to constantly be remembered as the would you be mad if I killed you guy. But Justin's actually someone that I think is kind of an interesting player. It would have been interesting to see how his game played out in the sense that, again, he was working alongside Chilltown, which is actually not a good thing considering Chilltown was on the outs. And he was kind of with that group to where he was going to be left out of the Cheryl vote when that eventually came. But again, through that, he had some allies at least. He also had, again, the connection to Krista. He had the connection to Kent, even though that was a rocky relationship. I think he at least had some potential moving on in the game. He wasn't as much of a hothead as he was, though, obviously due to his personality clashes, I don't really expect him to go that deep into the game. But I do feel like, again, at least there was some level of potential there. He at least had some inroads. So that's why he's here number 300. Now number 299, we're moving back to Big Brother 8, where here we're going to be talking about Joe, the second boot of the season, where Joe's a player that, straight up, I do feel like I'm probably not the most informed on his overall run in the season. I don't really know much of what Joe was really doing on his season, to where I do feel like Joe kind of felt like this very expendable person in the house, while also, again, like Carol, got a little bit unlucky in the fact that his ex-boyfriend was in the house alongside him, though also at the same time, I do feel like the way that Joe would treat Dustin did actually end up working against him, and no one really trusted Joe in the game. Now, again, something to give him minor credit for is the fact that at least he wasn't the initial target coming into week 2, though by the time that Danielle uses the veto, obviously he does become the target instead. And at least he did have Kale fighting for him to stay, so at least that's something, but still not much of anything, to where I don't feel like Joe really has much to truly praise. So he's here number 299. Number 298, we're moving on to a player that I think is a bit tough to assess, with this player being one that is largely credited for the creation of one of the most important strategies in the history of the show, but really his game outside that is kind of bad, and that person is Mike Lubinsky from BB5. Obviously, the person that gets credit of the formation of the backdoor, with him being the person to initially bring up the concept of putting up your target after the veto ceremony. However, outside of that, Mike Lubinsky's game is kind of bad. Again, I do think he has some good strategic thoughts at points. He definitely is a very innovative strategic thinker for the time. However, he is also someone that very much ostracized himself in the house. He did play a bit aggressively, where he did build these bonds with Diane and Drew and Marvin, and was kind of openly targeting the likes of Jason Scott, who were, again, the people in power, which was not a good move, along with the fact that he kind of just resigns himself by the end, which, to be fair, I don't know how much of a fighting shot he really would have had being on the block against Nokomis, but he doesn't really seem to try that much after the veto ceremony. So that's obviously something to critique as well, to where, again, I just think Mike Lubinsky is a player that, again, he is this high simply because of his strategic acumen, but I don't really see him doing well in most given seasons, to where he's here at number 298. Number 297, we're moving on to another similarly awkward player in the game, and here we do have Andrew Gordon from BB12, and Andrew's someone that I'm not as high on his strategic ability as I am with Mike Lubinsky. However, he at least made it further in the game. Andrew at least made it to week 3 while still having a very close ally in Brendan that wanted to try to keep him around. We also have Andrew being a pretty active player in him, coming up with that last-ditch plan to throw Hayden and Kirsten under the bus, along the fact that, again, he was still playing hard. It's just that, again, no one really trusted him. But again, it was still a guy that was pretty awkward in the house. He was definitely outside of the core group, to where he was just a pretty expendable number to be taken out at the time that he was, and one that just in general is a pretty sloppy player. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 297. And number 296, we're moving on to a player that is also really bad, being a pretty big social pariah in the house, though is also someone that at least had some allies. That person is Michael from BB6, a player that, again, seemed to pretty much be lucked out by the fact that he at least had Kaser, who is his friend from outside the show with him, along the fact that he obviously had a showmance with Janelle, where outside of that, he didn't really have much going on in the game. He was someone that wasn't particularly well liked. He was always looked at as pretty creepy by the other house guests. Though, again, the one thing I'll give him some credit for is the fact that he did seem to be part of an actual alliance at the very beginning of this group with Happy and Kaser, this men's alliance that at least was something, but it doesn't really cultivate to anything. And obviously he ends this week in this massive blowout that just really secures the fact that he's going home. So all that's pretty poor play, but there at least seemed to be some potential in week 1, but still an all-around pretty bad player that just was kind of the social pariah in the house. That's why he's here at 296. Now 295. So we're kind of starting this tier of players that were very self-destructive, but at least had some minor high points to them. We're starting that off with Amanda from BB9. And Amanda's a player that, again, I think she just came off as very annoying to her other house guests. She was someone that put a massive bullseye on her back, to where it does lead to her and Alex being targeted, with it mostly being an anti-Amanda sentiment over an anti-Alex sentiment. Though I will say the thing I will give her credit for is the fact that she did actually come relatively close to staying. There was this plan in place to keep Alex and Amanda around that fell through at the very last second, to where, again, at least there's that. And again, Amanda did seem like a very active player. Again, not necessarily the greatest player at points, but again, still active, where at least there's that. But to me, it's her complete lack of allies, and also the fact that she just completely annoyed most of the house and was a sloppy player, to where that makes her a bit tough to rank much higher here than number 295. Now number 294, we're moving on to a player that was in my bottom 10 the last time around, alongside a lot of the players we're actually about to be talking about. However, I moved them up just because I felt like there were some pros to their games. But either way, starting that grouping off with Caitlin Herman from BB20, who, again, the thing to give her credit for is the fact that she did seem to be liked socially. Again, she did have a pretty solid grouping of allies at the beginning. Now, again, she blew that up and turned against them by the end of week 1. But again, at least she did have these really good bonds with Haley and Rockstar early on. She obviously had the bond with Tyler. She had that relationship with Fessy. She also had connections to Rachel. She was seemingly decent socially. The problem is that she's a complete mess strategically, where obviously she just blows up her own game through flipping against her own alliance due to being manipulated by Tyler, and somehow is used as a scapegoat, as as this like shield for Tyler, or people are thinking that Caitlyn is manipulating him, which is pretty insane. To where again, Caitlyn is a really terrible player, with her just blowing up her own game, which is why she's here at number 294. Now number 293, we're moving on to another pretty well-known all-time bad player, that being Frenchie from BB23, which again is one of the more prototypical players that go on this massive power trip, only to proceed to be taken out the following week. This kind of what not to do if your first HOH. Though at the same time, again, like to give credit to Frenchie, I mean, he does come out of week 1 not even being the actual main target for the majority of the house. He gets very unfortunate in the fact that Kylan, one of the only people that was directly coming for him in particular, ends up winning HOH, along with the fact that there were just people that outright wouldn't have come for him. The likes of like a Brett, the likes of a Big D, Whitney, like there were people that didn't want to come for him at the end of week 1. So again, at least that's something, but obviously still a train wreck of a game, one that had him playing just way too aggressively. And because of that, for me, he's here at number 293. Now number 292, moving on to again a step above Frenchie, we got Devin Shepard from BB16. And again, Devin is essentially Frenchie, but at least made it to week 3 instead of week 2. At least that's something. Now to be fair, Devin had less allies by the time he gets taken out than Frenchie, where again, Frenchie still had some people wanting to keep him around. Devin didn't. I mean, Devin pretty much blew up all of his relationships by that point in the game. Though he does put in a valiant effort in his final week, where I actually think he plays his final week pretty well, even though he was pretty doomed to begin with, to where he did get some people to consider changing their minds and keeping him, though it was just a very tough task for him to actually get that to go through. But obviously it's just a disastrous first 2 weeks, him forming the majority alliance at the very beginning, only for him to then continuously doing things without his appliance's approval, making him a massive target by the end of week 1, and then he wins HOH week 2, only to then fail to do anything that he wanted, just making himself an even bigger target. So again, it's pretty terrible play, but I feel like his decent play in the final week, along with the fact that he did create the initial majority, was enough to put him at 292. Number 291, moving on to a player that also was a massive mess of a player, but at least this person had some people actively keeping her around for multiple rounds, and that person is Audrey from BB17, who again is obviously this massive overplayer in the game, someone that gets this massive bullseye on their back, with her constantly getting caught in her lies, and again, just overall a very sloppy player, but one that again at least did have like Shelly, Clay, and Vanessa wanting to keep her around, going out of their way to keep her around, despite the rest of the house wanting her out. To her, while obviously, yes, it is a fundamental issue, the fact that she had the majority of the house wanting her out to begin with, and was essentially lucked out by certain comp results, I do think it's still pretty good work that she was able to cultivate that core group that wanted to keep her around, though at the same time, she is later taken out by that group due to her own sloppy play. But to me, it's still that little bit of decent work there that has her at 291. Now, number 290, we're moving on to another sloppy player that was in my bottom 10, and here we do have Bella from BB21. And again, Bella is just another pretty messy player that just constantly leaks information, despite the fact that it's not even to her benefit. She throws her own allies under the bus, to where that just ruins her position in the game, in a position where, again, she actually was in a pretty good spot week 1, which is the main reason why she's at the top of this kind of grouping here, where, again, she at least was in a good position at one point, but then just blows that all up for herself. Though even then, survives until week 4, which is longer than most people we've talked about so far. And even in that spot, she's kind of screwed over by Christie's Diamond Power of Veto, where that really forced Cliff's hand in letting Bella go out that round, to where, well, again, no matter what, she wasn't really in that good of a spot anyway. It does kind of feel like she got screwed over by Twist to a degree, but really the rest of her game is also still very, very bad. So that's why she's here at number 290. Now, number 289, we're moving on to a player that made it the furthest of any of the people we're talking about so far, so at least there's that, but is also a player that really just scrapes that position by the skin of her teeth, and that player is Kale from BB8. And Kale is just kind of a terrible player. I mean, she's someone that, despite being the first HOH and could have gained a lot of leverage from that position, she simply doesn't, due to the fact that a lot of people didn't like her. A lot of people did not agree with her political beliefs, which also kind of left her on the outs, to where, while she had formed the Mrs. Robinson alliance, it never really felt like a true alliance, with Nick playing both sides anyway. You had like Zach and Mike, who were not the greatest allies for her. Also, she had this like relationship with Jen that obviously didn't do her any dividends. Obviously openly comes after Evil Dick, and that's not a particularly great move either. And she's simply like in this position to where, like, despite the fact that she could have gained so much social capital through her HOH, she really spends most of the game with no social capital, being on the block 3 weeks in a row before finally being taken out, which, to be fair, the way that she gets taken out is in a position where she's not even the target target. She gets taken out by accident, but it's still a pretty terrible game. So for me, she's here at number 289. Now, number 288, we're moving on to another player from BB8. Here we do have the third boot of the season, and we do have Mike. And Mike is someone that did seem like a very palatable person. I don't know how many people were really like upset at Mike in the game, but he also was just kind of there. I mean, he was just kind of a boring figure on the season that didn't really seem to build these like really lasting bonds outside of his relationship with the Mrs. Robinson Alliance. But even then, that was a minority group, and he even himself blows up his own spot to where, again, he wasn't the target coming into that round, but he makes himself the target by antagonizing Dick, which is just a terrible move there. Though again, at least he wasn't the initial target, so that's something. But again, it's enough to land him here at number 288. Now, 287, we're moving on to a player that I was a bit conflicted on. I really wanted to put this person at the very bottom of the list. However, the thing that stopped me is obviously the fact that this person at least had half the house wanting him to stay, and that person is Brayden from BB11. And Brayden sucks. Like, Brayden just seems like a terrible person. Obviously showed no remorse for making racist comments, and because, again, don't have any respect for him as a person. But in terms of the game he played on this season, he obviously did have half the house wanting him to stay. He did go out in a tiebreaker. He was also backdoored that week, where he didn't have much of a chance of saving himself in that light either. To where, again, the fact that he got half the house to keep him, despite the fact that he was making racist comments, is something. Though at the same time, how much that was even the work that he did, I think it's more so the work that Laura and Jordan did to pull votes over to his side than him doing anything actively right, where if anything, he actually burned his relationship with Lydia and Kevin even more, further securing the fact that he wouldn't stay. So again, it's mostly bad, but I do think the fact that he at least had a lot of people wanting to keep him around is enough to put him at 287. Now, number 286, moving on to essentially a slightly better version in Brayden, I guess, and that's David Gurton from BB15. And again, like, David sucks also. I mean, pretty much the same thing as I said about Brayden, just actually with less people wanting to keep him around. There's still some. I mean, he still had the likes of Aaron, Gina Marie, and Caitlyn on his side, though. For him, I think the main credit I'll give him is the fact that he wasn't actually supposed to be the target, in the sense that if it had not been for the MVP power, there is a good chance he isn't the target that week, where that's the only reason why he's on the block. Now, again, you can argue the fact that would McRae have just put up David to begin with had he known that there was no chance of getting David up in any other way. But still, I feel like that's at least something to give David some credit for, even though the rest of his game is also really bad. So again, here at number 286. Now 285. Again, another one of these first boots that had some numbers behind them. And here we do have Jose from BB18. And Jose is obviously someone that, again, had a good chunk of allies by his side. He had almost half the house wanting to keep him. He also had very strong relationships with likes of Paul and Victor. So again, there's at least some stuff to praise, though at the same time, obviously his overconfidence in the game was really bad. Lack of awareness of his position in the game is really bad. Third, the fact that he was openly targeting the vets when banking on the votes of the vets to keep him around, it's all just really dumb. So again, Jose is still pretty bad, and he's here at number 285. Number 284, pretty much the same as Jose. We got Keith from BB13. Again, pretty much the same thing. Again, was openly targeting the vets. Had almost half the house wanting to keep him around. Was nominated due to being perceived as the leader of the other group. I think there are some extra bad things with Keith in the fact that he did throw the veto in that spot and ended up doing some pretty poor work with someone like Kalia, who was turned against him. But I think between him and Jose, I do think it is pretty close. However, I decided to go with Keith over Jose, just simply due to the fact that I think Keith's position was a bit of a tougher one, with the fact that he came into a season with almost half the cast being vets, while Jose came in with less vets in the game, and through that show had more to work with, while Keith was largely screwed over just due to the overall format of the show, to where, again, because of that, for me, I do have Keith here at number 284. Number 283, we're finally getting to our first juror on the board. It's a really bad one, and here we got Cody Nixon from BB19. And obviously Cody was someone that was booted second and came back to the game, only to then be booted again just a few rounds later. Again, it is a really bad game. He barely even makes the jury phase of this season. But again, I'll give him like minor credit for a few things. First, in the fact that he did seem to be well positioned, at least in the first half of week one. That's something. Along with the fact that he was very good at competitions, where he's probably the best competitor of any of the people we've talked about so far. So again, at least there's that. Again, still a terrible player, someone that blows up his own game by trying to target Paul. And while you could say, okay, he got screwed over by Paul's plan of protection, again, Paul was going to stay anyway. So Cody plays a terrible game. Not a good player in the slightest. He's here at number 283. Now number 282. We're moving on back to a first boot. And that person is Lori from BB3, who is someone that comes technically close to staying on paper. Again, she does end up going in a 5-4 vote, to which you would think, oh, that means that 4 people wanted to keep her around. However, in reality, a lot of those votes were sympathy votes, where it was actually more of a consensus decision. But you just had the fact of like Danielle and Jason promising her their votes, and I didn't feel like it was necessary to betray that. But still, I mean, Lori is like, again, on paper, having people wanting to keep her around. She seemed to be largely affable to the cast. She just also seemed to be a very expendable person, which seemed to be the main reason why she gets taken out. Where she was even really the main target initially. The main target was Marcellus. So Jerry ends up using the veto on Marcellus, and through that, Lori ends up kind of going out by default there in a position where like she could have potentially gotten the numbers. Again, Roddy was someone that she was really close with, though decides to just let her go in that situation, which is pretty bad. So, and I think there definitely are things to criticize here. So, and despite her like seeming to be relatively close to staying, I don't think she actually was, but someone that did at least have some outs and did at least have some people that did like her. So again, that for me, that's enough to put her at 282. Now number 281, we're moving on to a player that had very little going on in the game, but again, at least they weren't the target and went out by accident, and that person is Jillian from BB19. Where obviously, yeah, Jillian is the kind of first boot of the season. I would qualify her as the first boot. They're going on the first formal eviction. But again, it feels like a very wonky circumstances for her to go out in, where she's initially nominated as a pawn against Megan, only for Megan to go home, to where she's then a pawn against Alex, only for Alex to win the veto, only for her then to be the pawn against Paul, only for Paul to have the pen of protection, to where she ends up being the pawn against Christmas. Which, I mean, to be fair, again, had Paul been on the block next to her, Jillian probably goes home anyway. But again, she had some pretty unlucky circumstances for her to even be getting to that spot. It makes me out of the fact that she at least had some allies. Again, she was very close to Alex and Jason, who did want to keep her around. To me, it's good enough to leave her here at number 281. Now, number 280, we're moving on to another BB19 player. This one probably being one of the most disappointing players in the show's history, and that person is Ramses from BB19, who, again, I remember coming into the season, there was a lot of hype for Ramses, with people thinking that he was going to be the next coming of like a Steve or an Ian, but he really just ends up being completely aloof in the game, which I'm too fair, I guess it's not that far away from Ian, which we'll talk about. But still, Ramses was someone that was just like outside the power structure for really an entire season, someone that Paul never really trusted, and through that was always expendable in the game. To where he was a backup target in week 2. He obviously gets taken out in week 4 when he's a pawn, though in a situation where he completely fails to get one of his own allies in Jessica to not put him on the block, which is all really bad. Now again, at least he had relationships with like Jessica and Elena in particular, but still his situation should have been one that was so avoidable, and he just completely fails at avoiding that situation. To where mixing that and the fact that he was just so aloof on how a lot of the game was being played up to that point, I do have to have him here at number 280. Now number 279, we're moving on to a player that has like some minor praise to give him, though outside of that, played a largely terrible game, and that person is Pooch from BB24, where again, the praise I'll give Pooch is the fact that he was targeting Taylor, and he was one of the most vocal people in getting Taylor to be on her way out at the end of week 1. Not straight up, again, it's not particularly good results, but it is something that he wanted, and it was something that he almost got done. And he obviously had a very good connection with Turner. He had a good relationship with Daniel. Again, there's at least something there. However, I think his week 2 is just terrible, where obviously in week 2, he decides to volunteer for the block in a position where, again, the women were already targeting him, but he didn't realize that. He didn't realize the amount of danger that he was putting himself in by volunteering for the block, which again, to be fair, they probably would have nominated him anyway, but he really just throws himself in the firing line for no real reason. And despite some of the men fighting for him to stay at the last second, again, it never was really going to go through, and he really just seemed to drop the ball socially, to where he really didn't even try to build a lot of relationships with the women of the house. And that's obviously a major issue, to where it's another one of these games where, again, there's like a minor thing to praise, but almost everything else is really bad. So that's why she's here number 279. Number 278, we have a similar player. This player lasting one more round than Pooch, so at least that's something. That is Brent from BB23, who at least did some decent work in week 1. I mean, he did end up convincing Frenchie to not targeting him, despite the fact that Frenchie was so gung-ho about wanting to go for him. Though again, Brett was able to turn that around and instead become Frenchie's closest ally by the end of the week. So at least there's that. Beyond that, again, it's pretty bad. Again, he is on the bottom coming to week 2, to where the majority of the house actually wants him out. Though he gets very fortunate with a Kylan HOH, who's one of the few people that wouldn't target him, only for him to then just be targeted the following week and be an easy consensus vote, where literally the entire house is on board with voting him out, and he somehow doesn't realize it, which is pretty insane. Though again, in comparison to Pooch, I feel like for me, I think his move of convincing Frenchie to keep him around is a lot more impressive than Pooch's throwing Taylor under the bus. So that's why I do have him above him at 278. Now 277, moving on to a player, our first player from Big Brother 10, and here we do have Steven. And Steven, I think, is a largely forgettable player in the grand scheme of things, though as pertaining to this list here, again, like, I do feel like he was someone that seemed to have some decent relationships, particularly with Keisha, where Keisha really fights for him to stay, though is obviously unsuccessful. But it did seem like Steven kind of struggled socially with most other people, and mixing in the fact that he did seem to be getting along with Brian, only for Brian to obviously eventually go home, and him being kind of the consensus target following that is all pretty bad, especially considering, again, he was on the block against Dan Giesling, of all people. I think Steven's game as a whole is pretty mediocre, and that's why he's here number 277. Number 276, we're moving on to a pretty sloppy player, one that was really just all over the board, but at least was a pretty aggressive player, and that person is Allison from BB9. And Allison is a player that did seem to have some decent connections early on. Again, she was very close to Sheila, but even beyond that, she had a very close relationship with Josh and Sharon initially, to where, again, they had worked together to create this plan to blindside Maddie and Natalie, only for that to not go through at the last second, which really ends up burning her relationship with Joshua, which causes her to be targeted the following week, along with also this entire ploy of her and Sheila pretending like they're a lesbian couple, which just made no sense of why you're doing this, and just completely burns any semblance of a relationship she had with Joshua, to where, again, I just feel like there's a lot of sloppy play here, to where while there are some minor pros and or potentially having the power to flip a vote at a point, it's really just a lot of sloppy play through and through. So because that, for me, she's at 276. Number 275, we're kind of starting this sub tier here of these people who really were not given much of a chance, but through that, there's not really much positive or negative to really say about them, so they're just kind of here on the list. And at number 275, we're starting that off with Jody from BB14. Or again, I mean, there's really not much to say about Jody. I mean, she wasn't given much of a chance here. She gets voted out simply because, again, she was perceived as the weakest player on her team on a season that was structured that way with the coach twist involved. Again, I don't think she really got much time to really show what she could really do, but also didn't show what she could do wrong either, where, again, she's just simply here on this list above the more actively bad players, but really can't elevate her too much beyond that, so she's here at number 275. And a similar thing goes for the next person we'll be talking about at 274. We do have Glenn from BB18. Now, I do think there's a bit more to know about Glenn's game than with Jody's. I mean, Glenn was in the game for a little bit longer, to where we do know that he was working with the group of newbies. He was very close to the likes of Jose and Victor and Paul, to where we at least have an understanding of where he truly was in the game. That being said, though, I do feel like he was, again, openly targeting the vets, to where I would not be shocked if he would have been a target, like, following Jose anyway, even if he had stayed, where he just feels like someone that could have been a very expendable number, especially with the vets running things, though obviously we'll never really see, though, again, another player I'm not willing to give that much credence to. There is here at number 274. Now, number 273, we have the quintessential player that didn't do anything right or wrong in the game, and that person is Neil from BB9, to where he literally left the game without us even seeing him on the show. That's something. Again, I really have nothing to say about his game. I don't know anything about Neil and how he was playing the game. So where, again, that's why he's here. He's simply just there on the list at number 273. Now number 272. Moving on to a very recent player here. This one being the formal first boot of the latest season. That being Kirsten from BB25. And Kirsten's someone that obviously did a lot wrong early on. I mean, she definitely did overplay her hand in a spot where it did cause her to be targeted by people that actually by people that she actually wanted to work with, and really didn't have much of a chance when she hit the block. Though the reason why she's as high as she is here is because I do think there were some unlucky circumstances surrounding her, particularly the fact that she was instantly on the short list to be nominated from the very beginning, which made her have to play a bit harder from the beginning, along with the fact that she gets a bit unfortunate who the other people on that list is. Where had, again, Luke been able to be nominated, I do feel like Luke would have gone out over her. Now, again, like, I do think at the end of the day, she did definitely still blow up her own game, but I do feel like there are at least some justifications for why her game blew up, which is enough for me to land her here at 272. Now, number 271, we have a similar case. The someone that probably got an extra bit more unlucky, and that person is Annie from BB12. And Annie is a similar case in the fact that, again, she had something greatly disfavoring her in the fact that she was the saboteur. That being the case, that essentially means that she's essentially put in this position where she's forced to lie to the others and forced to play a specific type of game that may have not benefited her. Now, outside that, again, I don't think she plays it particularly well. I mean, she attaches herself to Brennan and Rachel, who are clearly on the bottom. She didn't really seem to really make many other lasting bonds in the house, and obviously create this feud with Brittany by the time she leaves, and kind of just makes herself a bigger target by the time she goes, where, again, like, there definitely is a lot of poor play there, but I do feel like the fact that, again, she was a saboteur, and also the fact that she was the backup target, she has to get pretty unfortunate with Brendan's veto win, to where, again, for me, it's enough to land her here at 271. Now, number 270, another player that I don't think is that great of a player, but one that did face a lot of unfortunate circumstances, and that is Kemi from BB21. And, again, Kemi's a player that I don't think was ever that good at the game, but I do think there's at least like a level of potential with Kemi. I mean, Kemi is someone that was simply put on a cast that really did not favor her. I mean, this was a cast that just didn't really give her the time of day, and because of that, she was just like instantly on the bottom, instantly ratted out by people that she actually wanted to work with. And again, on her season, she really didn't have much hope. I mean, again, there was even a point where she was going to be the first boot of the season until Christy backed out of it the last second. Like, Kemi's game on BB21 is terrible, but again, I do think there is probably a bit more potential with Kemi, where even if she was on a more recent season, I do feel like she would at least be able to get more footing in the game. Now, at the end of the day, again, I don't really get the sense that she's still the greatest player in the world, but I do think there's like a level of upside there to where she's high enough here to be at 270. Now at 269, moving on to a player that for the most part is pretty bad, but another one that came into the game with pretty unfortunate circumstances, and that person is Amanda from BB4. And Amanda is someone that I've criticized in the past for being someone that didn't really try to play the game and didn't really try to save herself by the end of the week. But I will say something that I will say in her favor here is the fact that obviously she was massively screwed over by the X Factor twist, where not just the fact that she was in the house with her ex and Scott, which was just a very awkward situation for her to be in, which I do think definitely harmed her ability to build social connections. But even outside that, she came into the game late to where she was just instantly a target due to that from the very beginning. Now, again, I still criticize the fact that she didn't really try to stay in the game, and the fact that they voted her out over G, despite G clearly being a bigger threat in the game. Again, those are certainly issues, but I do think, considering how many bad circumstances she was surrounded in, and the fact that she does seem like a very palatable person, where I don't think anyone disliked her. Had she been given a better deal in the game, I do think she would have been someone that would have had a lot of longevity on the season, but simply because of how passive or really non-existent her gameplay was, I do have her here, number 269. Now at 268, we're moving on to a player that I do mostly look at as a pretty bad player, but this is one that I do think had some unlucky circumstances within the game that caused them to be taken out on the spot they were, and that person is Autumn from BB2, where again, Autumn isn't a particularly good player. She was someone that was kind of always looked at as a pretty expendable number, to where when she gets taken out, not really anyone's like really that upset at losing Autumn. While there definitely were some people that were wanting her to stay, it does feel like she's being taken out simply because it's kind of an easy move to make. But again, I think the fact that she was the target to begin with is a bit unfortunate. The fact that really only Krista was coming for Autumn. Like, pretty much everyone else would have probably had a different target this week, especially the top alliance, where they were clearly coming for Chilltown, and she just gets super unfortunate. The fact that the person that wins HOH is one that's, again, hooking up with Boogie and also trying to ride the middle. So, again, I do think there is some unfortunate circumstances there. Again, do I think she plays well outside that? No, I do think she's a pretty poor player, really a player that just seemed to be entirely emotion-based and never gained any traction in the game, but I do think those unlucky circumstances has her at 268. Now, 267, a similar thing, but from a bit of a later season, and this person is Monet from BB12. And again, I think a lot of the same things about this, where Monet is another person that, do I think she's a good player? No. Do I think she even had much longevity in the game? Not really, but she was at least not the target. But I think she gets pretty unfortunate in getting taken out in the spot that she does. Again, it's a position where really only Rachel is probably coming for Monet. Outside that, again, most of the house was coming for Brennan and Rachel. And had it not been Brennan and Rachel, it would have been someone like an Andrew instead. Like, not many people were coming for Monet, and she's got a very unfortunate HOH. Now, again, do I think she plays well within that? No. I mean, she does end up spending most of her time with Brittany and ends up spending a lot of time just bashing on the others. And it doesn't really feel like she was like really playing the game that hard, and was just simply kind of there and was once again pretty expendable to most of the power players in the game. So again, it's a pretty bad game still, but another one with some pretty unfortunate circumstances. So I have her here, number 267. Number 266. We're moving on to another similar player. Who would have guessed? And this person is JoJo from BB14. And for me, JoJo is probably the most unlucky of the people we've talked about so far, to where she's in this position where she's really the third option coming into her boot week, where again, initially the target was Willie, however Willie gets expelled, where then the target is Shane, but Shane wins the veto. To where it seems like JoJo goes out because of that, though outside that, again, JoJo's still not that good of a player. Again, another one that didn't really build the greatest bonds in the house, someone that didn't really seem to get the strategy of the game really at all. They did some pretty terrible campaigning. Again, like JoJo is still a pretty bad player, but again, out of the people we talked about recently, I do think she got probably the most unlucky of those people. So while I can't really see her doing well in really any season, there's at least that to it. So she's here at 266. Now number 265, we're moving back to BB12 for another relatively early boot, and this person being Kristen. And really, the difference between Kristen and Monet to me is not really that massive, outside the fact that just Kristen had a bit more longevity, where I kind of look at them as somewhat similar players in the fact that they're both players that didn't really seem to have that much strategy really going on. They did obviously get into these conflicts with Rachel. Now, obviously, Kristen obviously was able to avoid Rachel's ire for a bit longer in the game. And again, there was at least a point where it did seem like Kristen and Rachel did have a somewhat decent relationship, only for that to eventually crumble. Sorry, I think there's probably like a bit more ability to hide her true feelings there, but outside that, again, I do look at them as pretty similar players with pretty similar spots in the game. To be fair, Kristen was at least more connected to the core power structure through her relation with Hayden, but even then, that was simply just because Hayden was hooking up with her, not really due to anything she did really strategically in the game. So again, still don't really look at Kristen as a good player, so she's here at number 265. Now, number 264, again, sticking with people that went out due to some unlucky circumstances, with this person not even being the target by the HOH, and that person is Michelle from BB4. And Michelle, again, obviously has the same thing as Amanda, and the fact that they were very unfortunate in being exes that came in late, and through that didn't have as much social capital. But even beyond that, Michelle obviously wasn't even a target for G. Now, she was still looked at as a pretty expendable person, where they just put her on the block thinking that she was a pawn, but she still ends up going home here without her really even being the target from the HOH, which, to be fair, can be looked at as a negative in the fact that they were willing to put him up to begin with. But still, I do feel like Michelle should be higher than the last few people we talked about, because again, at least she was never even the target. Though again, outside that, she's not really a good player. She never really understood. She never really seemed to truly understand the game, and most of her attempts at playing the game ended up leading to failure, with her attempting to get G to not put her on the block, only for that to go nowhere. And really, just no one really took her seriously. And to be fair, a lot of that came down to her age. But still, again, she's not a good player, but she's one that has these minor positives that put her at 264. Now, number 263, a similar style of player in terms of game trajectory, though one that probably had at least like a little bit more potential longer term, and that person is Tanya from BB3. And Tanya is a similar case of a player that was taken out despite not being the initial target, though also gets taken out in a relatively close vote with a good chunk of allies by her side, where again both Lisa and Kiara very much wanted Tanya to stay in the game, where Tanya seems to go out due to the likes of Roddy and Eric being worried about the women gaining too much power. But again, it's the fact that she had those really close allies that make me want to put her higher on the list, though to be fair, I mean, even outside that, she's not particularly liked by a lot of the rest of the house. I mean, Marcellus absolutely hated her. Everyone else was willing to drop her, to where, again, it really is only the likes of Lisa and Kiara that she really built a super strong bond with. But I do think the fact that she was at least in the majority alliance at the point that she was voted out is at least something to give her credit for, to where she's here at number 263. Now at 262, we're keeping with an old school player here, this time going to Shannon from BB2. And Shannon is an interesting player here in the fact that she obviously did a lot wrong. I mean, she was not particularly well liked by the cast. She was looked at as a pretty big target for a lot of the house, though she is another one that coming into her boot week, she was actually not the target. It was going to be Will instead of her. However, she kind of ends up laying down her sword for Will, to which, again, that is a complaint to be had here from a pure game front. Though at the same time, again, she had a good chunk of allies. She had a very solid group of allies, and her obviously being an initial member of Chilltown, who were very loyal to each other, or at least she had that grouping. Now, again, outside that, I don't think she's a particularly good player, but she at least had these ride or die allies in the game, and seemed to be playing the game a bit harder than the likes of a Tanya and a Michelle, to where for me, she's a bit higher here at 262. Now at number 261, we're moving to a player that, I'll be honest, I kind of didn't really know what to do with this person, but I guess they're here, and that person is Casey from BB11, a player that didn't really get much traction in the game at any point. I mean, he was someone that was close to Jeff and Jordan. He was initially part of that grouping that tried to save Brayden, though ends up failing, to where once that happens, he's pretty much just on the bottom, not really knowing what's really going on in the game, and eventually gets taken out, with him being looked at as the biggest threat within that group by the time of week 3. It's again, there's not really that much to praise from his game, where I don't think he does much actively right, and he was someone that did seem to be, again, pretty aloof in the game, didn't really look at the game in that strategic of a lens, to where, again, I don't really have much truly positive to say about Casey, but he was someone that, again, still had a good backing behind him, a good chunk of allies, did come very close to being in a majority alliance. So again, those are minor positives for him, to where he's at 261. Now at 260, we're moving back to the most recent season of the show for a player that I just found infinitely frustrating, and that player is Red from BB25, a player that also, like Casey, didn't really seem to know much about what was going on in the game. He seemed to be pretty aloof at what was actually going on, didn't really seem to be playing that hard. I mean, actively made strives to just not make alliances in week 1 until he was evolved into Professors, and even then, he was clearly on the bottom of the Professors with no one really trusting him. And by the time of week 3, he was being targeted by his own group, and while he does survive all the way to week 5, and does get taken out due to a very strange circumstance of him at the last second, of him implying him wanting to rebuild his relationship with Cameron, that leads to the vote flipping on him, and was someone that at least built this very strong bond with Cirie, where Cirie really wanted to keep him around. Again, there are positives to Red's game, but really, I just found Red to be an extremely frustrating player, particularly due to the fact that he was just so aloof to what was going on in the game, and even when there were points where Cameron wanted to do something about their terrible position in the game, Red would just stop him, and instead want to be blindly loyal to this group that simply wasn't loyal to them. For while Red might not be the worst social player in the world, with there being some people that he can build really strong bonds with, I do think as a whole, he is still a really bad player, with him seeming to have no real sense of strategy. And because of that, for me, he's here at number 260. And at 259, we're moving on to another BB25 player. One step above Red, I do have Hisam. And Hisam's a bit tough to rank, because I think in a way you can argue that Hisam should be closer to the likes of a Devin Shepard, a Frenchie, one of these really controlling figures that blow up their games early on or are taken out by week 3. However, I think for me with Hisam, the thing that separates him from them is the fact that Hisam actually comes extremely close to staying. I mean, there was a point where it did seem like Hisam had the votes to stay, only for it to be shut down by Corey in the last second. So again, I think it shows some pretty impressive work that he was able to rebuild these bonds bonds with the people that actually backdoored him that week. Well, beyond that, he at least does get his target out in week 2, something that obviously like Devin fails at doing. And it's in general something that I do think has a somewhat rational mind for the game. It's just that the way he tries to enact his strategies is not in an optimal way, but I do think there is some method to his madness to where, again, I do think Hisam is someone that isn't a completely terrible player, though still one that has a really terrible game, because that for me he's at 259. Or 258, we're moving on to a player that I did consider putting alongside the likes of a Glenn, a Jody, a Neil. However, I decided to move him up a little bit in the sense that I probably have more faith in this person's overall game ability, and that person is Cameron from BB19. Obviously someone that wasn't really given much of a chance, did get voted out right away with no real time to actually campaign for himself, with him seemingly just being instantly targeted due to the fact that he was part of this nerdy archetype that had done well in recent years. I do think Cameron got very unfortunate with the hand he was dealt, but again, there's still very little game to truly assess from him to where, again, I could see the argument that he should be with the Glens and Jodys, but the reason he's above them for me is the fact that, again, he is a super fan of the show. He knows the show pretty well. I would personally have faith in him on a return to have a somewhat decent run to where, while this is all conjecture for sure, I still feel like he's someone that definitely has a lot of potential that we'll just never really see. So because that for me, he's at 258. Now 257, we're finally moving on to another poster where we're actually going to be talking about a decent chunk of them coming up, but this one still being in line with my previous list of worst players to make the jury, and that person is Sam from BB20. Again, a really terrible player. I mean, one that really had no sense of the strategic game, was really just kept around by the whim of Tyler, who had to go so far out of his way to save her in week 1. And even beyond that, would be this very irrational person in the house, getting constantly emotional, where no one really had respect for her, along the fact that, again, during her HOH, she made a ridiculous speech about Haley and Caitlyn, and also proceeded to almost backdoor one of her closest allies until he had to tell her not to, and then she just changes her mind on the whim. And again, beyond that, like, she doesn't really have much agency in the game. She's simply just being dragged all the way to the final 5 to where she's eventually taken out in a spot where it probably was even the best move for them to take her out in that spot, to where, again, like, I think Sam's an all-around bad player. Really almost nothing for me to actually praise about her outside of the fact that she made it all the way to final 5, and because of that, for me, again, she's here at 157. Now 156, again, another poster here, one that I think also played a bad game despite her being an all-time great character, and that person is Jen Johnson from BB8, who again is a pretty terrible player. I mean, from the beginning, she was an instant target. So had she not won the HOH in week 2, she's probably a goner there, and then proceeds to be nominated almost every week following that, only for her to be saved by either her winning the veto or her getting Jamaica to use the veto on her, which, again, can be looked at as impressive, but it's also a situation that really ends up burning her even more social capital in the game. And even then, despite being part of why Dick ends up staying in the final 9 round, him and Danielle then proceed to target her anyway the following round. And again, Jen is someone that obviously is an incredible character, but as a player, she really never gets any true traction in the game. She was looked at as annoying from her other players, and didn't really seem to know what she was doing in the game strategically either, to where, for me, I do have her here at number 256. Now number 255, we're moving on to a player that I thought started off doing pretty well, but then it really crumbles pretty quickly. And that person is Tiffany Russo from BB18, obviously his sister Vanessa, who we talk about much later on this list. But I do think Tiffany, again, had moments. I mean, I think in week 1 she was actually playing kind of okay. Again, she was aligned with the majority group. She also had that women's alliance she was a part of, and it seemed like she was doing all right, but obviously her game crumbles with her like trying to target Davon and her getting into conflicts with Frank, to where she's pretty much dead to rights in week 3 until the vote flips at the very last second to save her, only for her to then be taken out in week 4, where obviously she would just be looked at as this very unreliable number and this very expendable person in the house, to where, again, she certainly doesn't play it well, but I think that considering the fact that she at least had a good week in her, and also was able to actually win back Frank, to where Frank really fought for her to stay, and that's at least somewhat impressive, to where for me she's here at 255. Now number 254, moving on to a pretty bad player as well, back to being a poster, and this person is Dana from BB4. And again, I do think Dana is a mostly bad player. I mean, Dana is someone that was not really liked by most of her cast. Really, by the end of week 1, she was already being talked about as a potential target for the following round. She pretty much skates by the skin of her teeth pretty much her entire game. Where, again, even in week 2 where the Stooges won HOH, and despite the Stooges actually working with her, they still talk about the potential of backdooring her. She was then a big target coming into week 3, only for her to win HOH, and then proceeded to make herself an even bigger target by targeting Allison, which really doesn't play into her favor, with her just making herself an even bigger target for the following round, where she does get taken out there in a spot where, again, she is a bit unfortunate, the fact that Allison wins HOH. Though really her win equity by that point was completely dead. I don't feel like anyone was ever going to vote for her. Again, people found her annoying. Though I actually think, again, like, had she gotten a different HOH result, I think she could have had like some longevity. It did feel like the Stooges did want to bring her along in the game. Though also just obviously made herself a really expendable number, but still I do think she ends up being a pretty dynamic player, and that's kind of the reason why I do have her relatively high here, is because I do think, again, for the time especially, like, I do have some respect for the fact that she was so willing to play both sides, and she does end up flipping against her own alliance and try to find greener pastures, where, again, like, realistically she was on the bottom of both sides, didn't really matter. But I do have some respect for the fact that she was trying to make some moves there, to where, again, because of that, even though she is still a really bad player, she's still here at number 254. Now, number 253, we're moving on to a similarly terrible player, though, again, one that has at least one major high point, and that person is Jeremy from BB15. And again, like, Jeremy is a terrible player in the sense that he's just a massive dick, and no one really liked him outside of his core group. He always gets backdoored in week 3 due to him being looked at as a big target. Though, again, I will say, like, week 1, I mean, even though he was a dick and still behaved terribly, he at least was in the majority alliance. I mean, he was a central figure within the moving company and was a main reason why they had a lot of agency in the game, and was pretty integral to their positioning in the game, with him also bringing along with him the likes of Aaron and Gina Marie and Caitlyn. But then again, I mean, obviously all that really crumbles in week 2, but even then it kind of crumbles due to some unfortunate circumstances overall, revolving around the MVP twist, which is him getting screwed over to a degree. But still, I mean, like, the thing is, Jeremy's a player that I just have no real faith in. I think if he plays a billion times, he's always going to be a relatively early boot, with him just being kind of a dick and no one really wanting to work with him long term. But again, it is that minor aspect of positivity and the fact that he did have the moving company early on. It's enough to put him here at 253. Now 252, a similar player, but one that probably had a bit more prospects moving forward, and that person is Winston from Big Brother 20. Who, again, like, was in the level 6 alliance, though was a massive target within that alliance, where despite the fact that Winston should have been in a really strong spot on paper, he was pretty much always going to be one of the first targets from that group, to where really the opposing side had always planned on targeting him and Brett. And while Brett did end up being the main target for them, again, Winston was never in a truly good spot in the game. And considering the fact that his own allies are the one to vote him out here, I think that's something that's pretty damning to his game as well. Again, there's at least something to credit him for in the fact that he wasn't the main target from the HOH, but I do think it really just exemplifies Winston's gameplay even more. The fact that he was cut by his own alliance, the fact that he was looked at as his wild card, and this guy that, again, like, did not really get along with a lot of the people on the other side, to where, and he simply wasn't that good of a player. But yeah, he does come relatively close to staying, and had he stayed, I think he probably could have had a decent run in him. Obviously, the remnants of level 6 do make it very deep into the game, so yeah, at least there's something to prop him up for. But again, at the end of the day, I don't think Winston's that good of a player, and he's here at number 252. Now number 251, and we're moving back to some post jurors, actually a long string of post jurors that are not that good. Now, this person wasn't technically post jury in the sense that this season everyone was on the jury, but still someone that made it deep into the game, and that person is Amy Cruz from BB3. Well, that was the third boot of the season, only to then proceed to be brought back into the game, to where she is eventually taken out Final 4, but in a spot where she's essentially just dragged there and had no win equity, to where even if she had gotten to the end, it doesn't seem like anyone really respected the game she was playing and wanted to give her to win, particularly due to the fact that she was voted out and came back. And obviously all that's bad, but even beyond that, again, like, she was someone that did have some personality conflicts with people. People did not really gel with her. That's kind of what led to her being booted the first time around. And while she was a bit on her better behavior the second time around, she still really lacked in the strategic aspects of the game, to where I don't know if she was really even thinking about the game that strategically, and she was just so aloof at what was actually going on, to where I don't really have much to praise from Amy outside of her kind of longevity, and because that she's here at number 251. Now, number 250, continuing on with these somewhat later boots, And also keeping in line of my worst to make the jury video, we do have Lydia from BB11, who I guess is another one that didn't really seem to be that rational player, someone that played the game emotionally and kind of gets taken out due to her being this wild card due to that. And was someone that was kind of always on the bottom of whatever line she was on, where while initially she did work with the side that would later become the minority, she does obviously flip against that group to save herself, which again does show some dynamicism in how she plays the game, which at least that's something to give her credit for. But she kind of does so while burning those relationships in the process, to where again, like following that, she's pretty expendable to both sides, to where while she isn't actually targeted until week 4, again in week 4 her own quote-unquote allies are trying to get rid of her over the likes of Ronnie. And even then, she continues to be put up as a pawn and is just looked at as someone that could easily go from really just both sides. So we're mixing down the fact that I don't think she had any win equity as well. Though, again, I just don't feel like Lydia is a good player really at all. But she did have a bit more longevity than the people we talked about so far. And again, I do think there is at least that somewhat killer instinct in her to play self-interestedly, to where that's enough for her to land here at number 250. Number 249. We're moving on to a few pretty early postures that really didn't have much going on in the game, but again, at least they made it somewhat far, I guess. And at 249, we're starting that off with Jocasta from BB16, and again, Jocasta was there. I mean, she really was not involved in many alliances at all. I mean, she really had her relationship with Donnie, and that's really about it. Outside that, she was just constantly used as a pawn. She gets taken out in a spot where she was safe for a lot of the week, and again, was not the target of the HOH, but gets taken out due to this attempted flip against Nicole and Hayden, and trying to make a statement with them saving Zach. And again, like, I think that is something to at least give her somewhat credit for, is the fact that she does get taken out due to somewhat wonky circumstances. But again, she's in that position because she just simply was not an active player in the slightest, where no one really talked game with her, and she just really lacked agency in the game, to where, I mean, the reason why I would have her above Lydia is simply just due to the fact that she's probably less susceptible to having these emotional outlashes and everything. But again, like, really, Jocasta's not a good player either, and she's here at number 249. Now 248, I mean, that's essentially similar thing to Jocasta. We have Indy from BB24. Again, kind of the same thing in the sense that this was a person that didn't really have much agency in the game. She was just kind of there, being on the bottom of the majority group. Now I'll say, in comparison to Jocasta, I do have her higher here because I do feel like she at least did have a group at a point. Again, she was aligned with like the girls and was on the side alongside like Daniel and Nicole. Like, she at least had some people, even though again she wasn't particularly high on their pecking orders. While Jocasta again was mostly isolated, just with a couple relationships here and there. Again, it's like really that minor difference. Where outside that, again, Indy did not play well either. Again, was this very expendable person, where she was just an easy person from the drop at 11. Again, even then, to be fair, I mean, there was a lot of talk about taking out Alyssa instead, which is something that a lot of the house did want to happen, just that Kyle obviously stopped it. So again, like, I mean, Indy still plays pretty poorly, but at least there's like a couple things to praise her for, to where she's here at 248. Now 247, moving on to a player that is really bad, but I at least like that this person took their game into her own hands at the very end of it, and that person is Ashley from BB14, who again on paper is really, really bad. Again, kind of similar to the last few people we talked about, someone that didn't really have much agency in the game, was just kind of there, only to be taken out in the post jury. Now again, to be fair to Ashley, she gets 9th place, while last two we talked about got 11th place. And even beyond that, again, I will give Ashley credit for the fact that she did recognize the fact that she didn't really have much going on, and at least tried to make something with Frank and Boogie, and trying to save Boogie during his boot round, where again, like, was that actually her optimal move? I think it's questionable, but at least she tried something. At least there's some activeness to her game, unlike the likes of Indy and Jocasta, to where, you know, while it completely blows up on her face and she just proceeds to be taken out once Frank uses the veto, again, at least there's something minorly positive to say about her, to where for me, she's here at 247. Now number 246, we're moving on to a player that is also, for the most part, very passive. Though I think this person was probably better with one-on-one bonds in the house, and that person is Kathy from BB12, who is obviously becoming like kind of this meme player. But again, I think Kathy actually does have something to give her credit for, and the fact that, again, like, she built these strong bonds with people on their way out. I mean, she had good bonds, the likes of Monet and with Kristen. So again, at least that's something. I mean, she just seemed to be she seemed to be one of these people that, like, would at least talk to these people that were on the outs and not completely ostracize them. Now, again, straight up, I don't think she would have won a jury vote or anything because of it. Again, she didn't really seem to gain that much respect from doing so. And really outside that, I do feel like she is a pretty passive passive player that didn't really do much in the game. But again, like even when she gets taken out, she doesn't get taken out due to a diamond power veto, which is a pretty unlucky circumstance. So again, I think there's some minor positives here to say about Kathy. So she's here at 246. Now we're at 245. We're finally moving back to some earlier boots on the board. This one being the first boot of his season, though again, a very wonky one in that, and that person being Travis from BB23. And again, like Travis is one of these people that like wasn't really supposed to go home the week he goes home. I mean, there were like so many targets during that week. Again, Frenchie's HOH week, where it just felt like it went from target to target to target with unlucky circumstances happening to him left and right, from the fact that Christian wins safety, to the fact that Brent actually makes a pretty good pitch to Frenchie, to the fact that DX wins the veto and then uses on Kylan, who are two other targets, to where it eventually just all lands on Travis being taken out due to just so many other people gaining safety along the way. Now again, Travis was a pretty passive player. I don't think he does anything that much right in the game, but I also feel like he doesn't do that much wrong either. And because that makes it a bit tough to really place him. But yeah, I do think the fact that, again, like I don't really have much to truly criticize outside of his passiveness in the game is what leaves him relatively high here at number 245. Now at 244, we're kind of moving to this kind of like little sub tier of the list of these kind of later pre-merge players that demonstrated like some potential, though none of them really gain any true traction in the game. But we're starting all that off with Whitney from BB23, who, and I don't think is an entirely bad player. I mean, I could see a world where Whitney comes back and actually plays a somewhat decent game if she were to ever come back. But I do think from what we saw in BB23, I just don't really feel like she really got much to really do there. I mean, she was aligned with the likes of Brent and Frenchie, and they obviously end up going relatively early. So she's kind of just an expendable number in the game, one that no one really had much of a connection to where she's kind of an easy person for Christian to go for, even though it wasn't the optimal target for him. But again, I think her issue is obviously the fact that she didn't really have anyone fighting for her. But despite that, again, she seemed to be okay socially. She seems to be someone that, again, could do well on a future appearance, but didn't really get to demonstrate any of that ability here. And because of that, she's here at 244. Now at 243, we're moving on to a player that probably demonstrated a little bit more game ability, but is in a very similar spot, and that person is Brittany from BB16, who again is in a very similar position to Whitney, being this person who never really gains any traction in the game. I mean, I think actually on paper, Brittany probably even had less traction in the game, in the fact that she was instantly being used as a pawn and never really was taken seriously. But I do think Brittany probably had like a little bit better reads on the game. I think she was a little bit more aware of what was going on around her, and her seeming to pick up on the fact that Derek was running the game, and at least there's that. I mean, like really, again, she's still not a good player, but I remember her having a bit more awareness of her game, where because of that, for me, in comparison to Whitney, in a spot where they're very similar, that's really the minor difference that has her above her at 243. Number 242, we're getting to a player that was a bit tough to assess, with this being a player that I do think gets kind of dragged down by the player they were attached to, though at the same time, they didn't play well in their own right either. And at 242, we do have Jessica from BB19. Obviously, I think a lot of her game goes downhill due to Cody. The fact that Cody makes himself a social pariah, and she's obviously connected to Cody and ends up defending Cody, that makes her a social pariah as well. On the fact that she ends up winning HOH, only to then accidentally take out Ramses, that's really bad. Ends up being on the bottom for the entire pre-jury phase of the game, to where she eventually gets taken out at the very end, in a spot where she also would have been in danger had the halting hex not been played. Where really, I feel like for me, the only true positive I'll give her is the fact that she stays over Dominique in week 3 and does do some okay work during that week. But really, a lot of the rest of her game is really plagued by Cody. But again, she's really not playing well surrounding that either. Again, like, I still can't believe the fact that she ends up putting up Josh and Ramses with her HOH, which is just such a waste. So again, I think Jessica's a player that probably has more potential. I think if she were to play the game without Cody, I could see a world where she plays a somewhat decent season, but really, the season that we did get from her was pretty terrible. So for me, she's here at 242. Now at 241, we have a similar case, though I think this player probably demonstrated a little bit more of their potential than Jessica, and that person is Caitlyn from BB15, who, again, is not a great player in the grand scheme of things. I mean, someone that was still attached to the Aaron Lauren and Gina Marie's of the world, and herself also made some kind of icky comments, though obviously not as bad as the other two. But really, I feel like Caitlyn comes off as probably the most competent player of those three, at least at the time of her eventual elimination, which plays into why she's eliminated. I mean, she was eliminated because she was looked at as the bigger threat of the three. So obviously, I guess it's an issue, the fact that she wasn't able to hide that threat level. But again, I do think she was doing pretty well socially in building these relationships outside of her core group by the time she was eliminated. Again, she won a comp, she made this like Grasshoppers alliance, like she at least had some stuff going on. Though I think realistically, she's still not a particularly good player. For straight up, I think like the other three that we just talked about probably have more potential than Caitlyn if they were to return. Though I think Caitlyn is probably the one that actually got to do a bit more in the game than the others. Though still not a particularly good player, because that for me she's here at 241. But with that, that is the end of part 1 of my ranking of every Big Brother player. Now again, there will be 3 more parts following this, each part containing 80 people, which should all be released pretty soon after this one. However, again, obviously I wanted to break them up here considering how massive these parts will end up being. So obviously stay tuned for part 2 where I go through the next 80 people on the list. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.